I recall the hopes of those placed in my care in the years after the Rimworld's campaign, and in the horrors of the hegemony, the souls of the 335th Division I commended to his grace. I recall the sacrifice of those who laid down their lives to free Terra from the usurper, and that of those who forsook their homes so that the Great Father's vision of a true unity could be birthed in the Pentagon. The Challenges of Faith, Khan Wyndham Khatib, The Liberation of Terra, Volume 1. Rimworld's Republic, Erewhon 5, September 2nd, 2768. Flashes of lightning briefly lit up the miserable landscape. Each drop of the heavy rain on Sergeant Kim's plasticized parka created a cacophony of sound which made it difficult to hear anything else. Sitting for nearly 2 hours now, just below the ridgeline of this grassy wet ground, was not something that was advertised in the SLDF recruitment holovids. However, the last few years of Kim's career had been defined by long and miserable periods of waiting, interrupted by short stints of incredible violence. It had been less than a month since word spread across the ranks that the Rimworlder resistance had nearly killed General Kerensky during his visit to Erewhon. Up to that point, it was assumed that the SLDF occupation forces had the planet well in hand and the locals were pacified. Of course, that turned out to be a ruse. Underneath the surface, the Rimworlders were steadfast and furious at the Star League's presence on their world. General Kerensky's visit was at the tail end of 3 months of relative peace and quiet. There were the occasional IEDs and shootings, but in general the attacks were seen as disorganized and carried out by lone wolf Ameris true believers. Kim and the other COs were called into a briefing room on the 17th of August and informed that General Kerensky had just barely avoided an attempt against his life in an elaborate and well-planned attack. Only through quick action by Fort Merrimack soldiers and a faulty dead man switch in the hands of the attacker was the entire fort saved from a nuclear detonation that would have surely killed Kerensky and all others in a several-kilometer radius. A week later, Sergeant Kim and his unit were deployed to the rolling grassy and boulder-strewn hills a few dozen kilometers away from the fort. Normally, the sounds of bleating sheep were maddening, though tonight's rainstorm offered a short reprieve. Even those irritating animals knew better than to be out in this miserable weather. Scanning through the rain with his powerful rangefinder binoculars, Kim paused when the dull gray mass became visible on the roadway. It looked like a civilian van at first glance, but when Kim zoomed in, it didn't look right. The driver was wearing a shabby overcoat, but had his head on a swivel, looking left and right nervously. After the events of August 17th, that was enough. Sergeant Kim looked at the men of his unit crouching out of the driver's sight in their foxholes and opened his helmet comm link. He said, "We've got suspicious contact. Hold until my order, but be ready." After switching to a private channel, he continued, "Chalmers, you ready?" "Raring to go. I'm not sure how much longer I can stand laying down," the accented voice responded. A few moments later, the truck sped up unexpectedly. Clearly, the driver saw something and hit the gas. Kim was quick to call for disabling shots, and several loud cracks of gunfire penetrated the sound of the falling rain. Now, with several large holes through its engine block, the truck sputtered and rolled into the roadside ditch next to some barbed wire fencing. Silence descended again as the SLDF forces waited. If the truck was carrying another device and the driver set it off in a panic, they would all be obliterated. "Rifle Squad 4, you're in. Keep an eye on the driver. If he moves, put a mag through the door. I want to know if that truck is clear in the next minute," Kim said into the comm, still watching the vehicle through his binoculars. Following the affirmatives, the squad closed in on the truck. Kim never felt good about placing his soldiers into harm's way, and as the seconds passed, his heart rate rose. When the rifle squad stepped within 5 meters of the truck, a loud directed explosion lashed out from the side of the vehicle, dropping the entire squad to the concrete. "Open fire," Kim bellowed into the comm link as the rest of the unit sought to avenge the fallen squad. Rifle and laser fire lanced into the truck from front and rear. As if also triggered by Kim's command, 3 more vehicles, this time armored carriers, rolled over the ridge across the road from the SLDF position. Immediately, they opened up on the Star League soldiers with machine guns and autocannon fire. Several SRMs streaked out in corkscrews that sent dirt and grass plumes high up into the air. Kim ducked, along with most of the other SLDF soldiers, and quickly opened the comm link with Chalmers. "This is it. Come say hi." "On it, Sergeant," came the response. From behind the hill where Kim's unit was dug in rose a massive machine. It was covered in grassy camo tarps that blew in the poor weather and created the impression that it was wearing a gigantic cloak. Its broad shoulders and menacing height were quickly obscured by the powerful beam of light which emanated from the top of the battlemech. Fire from the rimworlders dropped off a bit as many of those who had piled out of their armored vehicles were temporarily blinded by the light that made it look like they were subjects of the world's largest police interrogation. The SLDF infantry rose from their positions and began to pour fire into the ranks of the new arrivals as the battlemech lifted its arms and bathed the first of the armored vehicles in laser fire. 2 of the 3 medium lasers cooked off most of the APC's left side armor, and the Sunglow large laser finished it off by bathing the internals with thousands of degrees of conflict resolution. What had been intended as a plan to lure the SLDF infantry into an ambush turned into a rout as the hidden battlemech had drastically shifted the balance of power. Many rimworlders fled into the rain while the Guillotine stepped closer. Its short-range missiles spiraled into the 2nd APC while the 3rd struggled to find traction in the increasingly muddy, stirred-up incline of the hill. Just 20 seconds later, this short stint of violence was over, and once again the raindrops were the only noise. Elsewhere in the Inner Sphere, when the 11th SLDF Army landed on New Earth in 2776, it was a return home for more than just those who had held out in resistance actions against the occupying Ameris forces. Among the Highlanders, Crabs, and Crockets that stepped out of the SLDF dropships that day were 70-ton mechs designated the GLT-3N Guillotine. It was a homecoming for these intimidating battlemechs because New Earth was the home of Newhart Industries' Guillotine production lines that had been making the Guillotine since its introduction in 2499. For almost 300 years, the Guillotine had been a heavy hitter not just for the Star League Defense Force, but among the Terran Hegemony armed forces and house militaries. It was so well regarded that it became a top pick for units as it was designed to smash through enemy lines and survive the experience. With a good mixture of agility, armor, and weapons that largely didn't have to rely upon ammunition, the Guillotine was always useful. The fight on New Earth was intense, and as the 61st Infantry Division, the 331st Battlemech Division, and the 146th Royal Battlemech Division closed in around Ameris' forces, the ferocity of the defenders led to high casualty rates and widespread destruction of the planet's cities and industrial sectors. Ultimately, the use of nuclear weapons against the civilians resulted in high numbers of dead and displaced. In just a few months of fighting, much of the urbanized population centers were obliterated. Estimates show nearly a 75% reduction in New Earth's population by war's end. For the purposes of our story today, another major casualty from this conflict was the destruction of the Guillotine production line. While this wouldn't mean the end for the design, it did contribute to increasing scarcity during the ensuing succession wars. But what made the Guillotine such a cherished battlemech? Constructed from Crucis 1 endosteel wrapped around a Vox 280 fusion engine, the GLT-3N Guillotine could reach a top speed of 64 km per hour. The addition of Anderson 398 jump jets, along with a reinforced command chair and leg construction, further improved the battlemech's agility and pushed the movement profile to 464. 12 tons of Ulston Prime standard plate armor provided 192 points of protection, which placed it on the upper end of the 70-ton pantheon. For comparison, the GHR-5H Grasshopper carried 13 tons of standard plate and the CTF-1X Cataphract carried 11 tons. With 6 tons of cockpit and gyro along with 25 single heat sinks, that left 13.5 tons of mass for weaponry. Rather than going with a flashy weapon like a PPC or a large-bore autocannon, Newhart's engineers added a Sunglow large laser to the left arm. While the laser itself was quite reliable, the connection between weapon and the fusion power converter at the core of the mech took a complicated path through the shoulder joint. Only after production started was it discovered that sometimes if the mech's left arm was raised up above shoulder level, the fiber optic lines to the laser could become tangled and prevent the laser from firing. Experienced pilots learned to troubleshoot that situation by briefly lowering the arm and raising it again, which usually fixed the issue. Inexperienced pilots sometimes tried to force the arm higher to unjam it, which could snap the cables entirely. The fix for it was costly, and it required running entirely new lines from the center torso to the arm. Moving on to more pleasant news, 4 ExoStar 2 medium lasers were added to the Guillotine to further bolster its brawling credentials. With 2 in the right arm and 1 in each side torso, these reliable weapons would end up being workhorses through hundreds of years of warfare. Only relatively recently on the timeline were they challenged by their extended range and pulse laser options. Finally, a Coventry SRM-6 launcher was installed into the center torso to make closing on the mech an opportunity to taste high explosive. The launcher's 1 ton of ammunition was set into the right torso and was protected by case, which vented any ammunition explosions out the back of the mech rather than toward the engine or the squishy mech warrior in his or her cockpit. Overall, the GLT-3N Guillotine represented a good balance between mobility, strength, and firepower. Just keep in mind when comparing it to other heavy mechs with more firepower that opportunity cost spares no one. Of course, we can't forget one of the mech's defining features. A searchlight was added above the cockpit, which contributed greatly to the battlemech's unique look. The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing your own good in your own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it. Each is the proper guardian of his own health, whether bodily or mental or spiritual. Mankind are greater gainers by suffering each other to live as seems good to themselves than by compelling each to live as seems good to the rest. On Liberty, Harvard Classics, page 207, John Stuart Mill. After serving valiantly through the Reunification War and Ameris Civil War, the Guillotine was a long-proven design. As it turned out, the Star League was not quite as resilient. As Alexander Kerensky marshaled his forces for the Exodus, many guillotines traveled with him, safely nestled in their dropships. From here, the story of the mech splits between the SLDF guillotines snapped up by the great houses and those that traveled out into the unknown with Kerensky. While the guillotine would see extensive use no matter where it was, the Exodus mechs would eventually lead to a new 2C design, created in 2889, while the Inner Sphere-bound guillotines would be hit by a Succession Wars downgrade with the technological loss of endosteel and case. As the Succession Wars dragged on, bringing humanity to the brink of collapse and even beyond in some star systems, the noble guillotines that survived battles ended up being repaired in ad hoc fashion. With each new repair, the new arm or leg had to be forged from standard materials rather than endosteel. That busted up case that had to be tossed away to buy mass anyway. The compromises and half measures were plentiful. One of the official Succession Wars variants for the Guillotine was designated the GLT-4L in 2825, and thankfully it wasn't as painful as some other downgrades for battlemechs. As mentioned before, the endosteel was gone, as well as that right torso case. The loss in mass savings was paid for with the removal of heat sinks, leaving just 22 out of the original 25. A full alpha strike while on the run left the 4L at 4+ into the red, which was not a huge issue so long as the next attack was tempered. Heat was a little bit more of an issue if the jump jets were used, but it wasn't egregious. The 4L remained a strong brawling heavy mech, even though it did require the mech warrior to be a bit more Spartan concerning how it was used. Protecting that right torso SRM ammo would be high up on the priority list. The other Succession Wars variant was designated the GLT-4P, and its builders leaned more into offense at the cost of 2 tons of armor plating. The Guillotine 4P still carried 22 heat sinks, the jump jets, and the traditional weaponry, except for the left arm large laser, which was swapped out for a particle projection cannon. This meant that the 4P ran a little hotter and required a bit more finesse with heat management. In exchange, it could hit targets at slightly better distance for 2 additional damage. If one was a fan of the PPC over the large laser and didn't mind those trade-offs, the Guillotine 4P would be a solid pick over the 4L. Then the Guillotine fired, its suite of medium lasers well suited for urban combat. The shots bathed the legs of Smokey's Caesar, ripping away armor plating in every direction. The Caesar staggered forward like a drunk, moving along a mound of rubble to stay out of the line of fire. Joey and Grant Watkey fired at the Guillotine at the same time. Watkey's shot found its mark first, a PPC blast from his Clint ripping into the center torso to savage the armor plating. Joey's large and medium lasers followed a millisecond later, digging deep into the same part of the Guillotine's armored chest. The holes belched smoke, hinting at further damage within, but the mech seemed barely affected by the assault. It slowly turned and locked onto Watkey's Clint. Call of Duty, page 121, by Blaine Lee Pardoe. During the course of the Succession Wars, the number of functioning guillotines continued to dwindle. Even with an on-again, off-again production by Irian Battlemechs Unlimited within the Free Worlds League territory. Though attrition was fairly consistent across the inner sphere, the guillotine was very rarely seen in the periphery due to the mech's connection to the SLDF. Due to continued production within their borders, you're much more likely to see guillotines among the Free Worlds League units and affiliated units than anywhere else. One previously unmentioned benefit of the guillotine's energy weapon-heavy loadout was persistence on the battlefield. When the Free Worlds League started to raid Capellan-held worlds during the Second Succession War, the Capellans were frustrated by the raiders' apparent lack of need to resupply. Reports of worlds hit by House Merrick forces hinted at how this was possible. They were using 24 guillotines as a forward guerrilla force, harassing Capellan planetary defense forces and causing mayhem wherever possible. The entire venture was so successful that 2 planets ended up being taken in their entirety. Sure, they would be later taken back during the Third Succession War, and 2/3 of the guillotines ended up being lost in action, but you can't make an omelet without cracking a few eggs. Look at me, Mr. Moneybags YouTuber, able to afford eggs. If the Sky Mechwarrior had noticed the shot that streaked past his war machine, he paid it no mind. Instead, he kept his attention focused solely on McCall. He poured laser fire into the already damaged mech while his partner, the Guillotine, did the same. Lowry threw the Victor into a shambling run, screaming for Cooper and Hansen to engage the rebels with their long-range missiles. Her headlong charge began too late. The Rakshasa stepped in close to McCall's Highlander, firing its large lasers point-blank into the rent in the big machine's side. The Legion mech reeled like a drunk, and Lowry realized that they had gotten his gyro. She fought her swaying mech as she desperately tried to close range with the enemy. The Dying Time, page 233, by Thomas S. Gressman. By the 3040s, the guillotine was a pretty rare sight across the inner sphere. With the reintroduction of endosteel and case, thanks to the Helm Memory Core discoveries, Irian Battlemechs was able to dust off the plans for the Guillotine 3N and then build upon it with their own tweaks. The resulting Guillotine GLT-5M, released in 3049, looked a lot like the Star League version, except for the swap of the large laser over to the ER variety. Now you might be asking, well, Mech Frog, surely if they added an ER large laser to a mech, they would compensate by making sure there were double heat sinks. And I would say, ha ha. The 5M carried 25 single heat sinks, which was a return to form, but the 4 additional heat from the ER large laser throws the heat management equation into the bin. A full alpha strike on the run left the 5M at 5+ into the red, which was immediately going to cost the mech some of its movement until the heat could be bled off by the heat sinks. At least the case in the right torso is back. Praise Kerensky for small miracles. Overall, the 5M is basically the 3N with extra steps, but one has to look at it and wonder what could have been had double heat sinks entered the fray with a steel chair. Perhaps we'll soon find out. Before we leap ahead to the next variant, we do need to talk about Comstar. As many of us are now well aware, our favorite telecommunications cult spent the Succession Wars ferreting away Star League knickknacks for a rainy day. This included a large number of guillotines, which made their reappearance with the disclosure of the existence of the Comguard. It was timely considering the showdown with the clans was on the horizon. Among Warhammer's Black Knights, Marauders, and other heavy mechs, the GLT-3N Guillotine served with distinction on the battlefields of the Tukayyid trials. Clearly, the old gals were still up and kicking after being in cold storage for centuries. Good on them. One notable one-of configuration for the Guillotine was the GLT-3N Estridson, which was owned and piloted by Captain Harold Estridson, who served as a commanding officer for the first Dracons within the Draconis Combine. Rumor has it that this upgraded version of the 3N with 15 double heat sinks was a Comstar prototype that was accidentally shipped to the unit. It carried an ERPPC in the left arm and a surprising 12 medium lasers scattered over the battlemech. Finally, an SRM-6 launcher sat in the center torso, fed by 1 ton of case-protected ammo in the right torso. While obviously the mech would have heat issues firing everything, the prospect of being hit at close range by 12 medium lasers is terrifying. The elite warrior turned, and Mechwarrior unleashed a salvo of short-range missiles at him at nearly point-blank range. It hit the torso and cockpit of the ugly battlemech. The assault mech seemed to collapse as another Wolverine dumped in a blast of PPC fire, sending blue arcs of discharging particles dancing over the creation, sparking and searing as armor plating flew right in front of her own Guillotine. Kran's battlemech fell face first into the grass, plowing a furrow as it slid. Wisps of steam rose from the wet sod coating the mech. Betrayal of Ideals, page 7, by Blaine Lee Pardoe. Stomping forward to 3062, the next major upgrade to the Guillotine was designated the GLT-8D. Along with Endosteel and the long-awaited upgrade to 14 double heatsinks, the Guillotine was packed with improved weapons that boosted its overall power. It even received an additional half-ton of armor over the 5M, bringing the total to 12.5 tons. The biggest change for the weapons loadout was the addition of a second ER large laser to the right torso. It's basically a BattleTech law of nature at this point that anytime you add double heatsinks to a classic design, you have to undo the benefits by adding an ER large laser. Sorry, I don't make the rules, I just sigh at them. The traditional 4 medium lasers were all upgraded to the ER versions, boosting their range out to 12 hexes at the cost of 2 additional heat per shot. Finally, the SRM-6 was also upgraded to a streak version to save on that precious ammunition, and potentially ruin the day of a light mech that's unlucky enough to catch its lock. All of the energy weapons were aided by the addition of a targeting computer in the left torso. The 8D is a solid Guillotine variant that suffers a bit more than it should from heat issues once the ER mediums and streak launcher come into play. A theoretical alpha strike on the run would generate 50 heat, leaving the mech at 22 plus into the red. While it could be done in the perfect moment or in an act of desperation, that would leave the mech practically idle on the next turn and does risk an ammo explosion on 4 plus. A much more likely strategy would be the use of ER large lasers until within striking distance of the ER mediums, at which point you stop using the large lasers in favor of the 4 mediums and the streak SRM-6. 6 years later, in 3068, Irian produced the first of a trio of Guillotine variants which would each share the 6WB designation. They were each a significant departure from earlier variants from the bones out. The first GLT-6WB was constructed using a standard structure, engine, and carried 11 double heatsinks. 11 tons of ferrofibrous armor provided 197 points of protection. To improve the mech's longevity, a compact gyro was added. It carried a heavy PPC in the left arm as a primary weapon, and it was backed up at long range with the installation of an LRM-15 in the center torso, fed by 1 ton of ammunition in the right torso. When closing in on a target, the Guillotine could bring 4 ER medium lasers into play. Finally, an improved C3 computer was added to the head. This was made possible through the use of a small cockpit to free up an extra critical location. Able to hit hard with accurate fire, the 6WB could be a menace in a brawl. Its only serious downsides were the 8 shots of LRM ammo without a case and the 11 double heatsinks, which made alpha strikes an extreme luxury. 2 years later, the GLT-6WB-2 went completely off the rails with Endosteel, an XL engine, a compact gyro, and 11.5 tons of standard plate armor. The improved jump jets pushed the mech's movement profile up to 466, and 10 double heatsinks round out their hardware. Starting at long range, a light Gauss rifle was added to the left arm and fed by a single ton of ammunition in the left torso. An LRM-5, aided by an Artemis IV fire control system, was installed into the center torso and fed by 1 ton of ammunition in the right torso. Moving closer, 2 light PPCs could reach out to 18 hexes for 5 damage, and starting at 12 hexes, a pair of ER medium lasers split between the side torsos could melt some faces. Finally, an improved C3 computer was installed into the center torso. While no doubt the 6WB-2 is more mobile than previous Guillotines, it was paid for with that XL engine, which makes me a bit sad for a machine known for being effective in a brawl. This variant strikes me as more of a command mech, with most of its weaponry tuned for the mid and long range. With all the other options out there, this one is definitely not for me. The last of the 6WB trio was the GLT-6WB-3, and thankfully it doesn't stick with the XL engine. It's much closer to the first in the series with standard structure, 11 tons of ferrofibrous armor, a compact gyro, and a small cockpit. The 464 movement profile is back, and 11 double heatsinks were added, which will definitely be getting a workout. Again, a heavy PPC is sitting in the left arm, dominating the build, and it was backed up by the LRM-15 in the center torso, fed by 1 ton of ammunition located in the right. 4 ER medium lasers sit in their traditional locations in the side torsos and right arm, and the C3 slave computer was added to the left torso. Finally, a Guardian ECM was placed into the head, facilitated by a small cockpit. This makes the 6WB3 our Operation Sneaky Sneak Guillotine of the day. Overall, this variant is very similar to the original 6WB, and the choice between the two will likely fall to what you need out of your C3 network setup. A bright red beam instantly shot from the Hussar, knifing through a thick tree and skimming the edge of the guillotine as it rose into the air. Stax sent 2 salvos of short-range missiles screaming into the woods toward the enemy mech, but didn't consider whether he'd scored hits or not. He had to nail his landing exactly right. The Hussar fired again, but its turret didn't have enough of an angle and the shot went wide. As the SRMs exploded around the mech, Stax yanked his controls down, bringing the guillotine, he hoped, right behind the Hussar. Promise, Shrapnel number 7, page 133 to 134, by Tom Levine. Our last official configuration for the guillotine is the GLT-7M, and thankfully it's much more traditional build in comparison to the previous trio. The endosteel is there, standard engine, and 12 tons of standard plate armor. 16 double heat sinks were crammed in to make the energy weapon build viable. In the left arm, an ERPPC was installed as the primary long-range damage dealer. It was further boosted by a PPC capacitor, which improved the damage at the cost of 5 additional heat when firing. 2 light PPCs in the right arm could also add to the damage starting at 18 hexes, and 2 ER medium lasers could help starting at 12. Finally, a Streak SRM-6 was added to the center torso, and it was fed by 1 ton of Case 2 protected ammunition in the right torso. Overall, the 7M comes pretty close to being an ideal form for the battle mech. It's dangerous at all ranges, and the 16 double heat sinks can do a fair job of keeping the mech running and gunning. With Case 2, ammo explosions are no longer devastating, and the mech can stay in the fight for a considerable amount of time without having to worry about XL engine criticals. Give it a go if you're ever playing this far down the timeline. Of course, as good as the 7M variant is, I think I can come up with something equally as fun, even if it strays a bit from tradition. I started with a standard 3N with my 1MF version. I added endosteel and converted the heat sinks over to 15 doubles. The 12 tons of standard armor remain, as well as 4 jump jets to maintain that fun 464 movement profile. For an added boost, a supercharger was included into the center torso, which could push the movement profile up to 484 when the moment is right. For weaponry, I added a plasma rifle to the left arm, fed by 2 tons of ammunition stored along with it. That's 20 shots for the uninitiated out there. Sharing a similar range profile, 2 MRM-10 launchers were installed into the right torso, sharing just a single ton of ammunition that is protected by Case 2. That's 12 shots per launcher, by the way. In a fight, those would be an equivalent of an LRM-20 together with no minimum range. The penalty to accuracy is a thing, but I envision these launchers would typically be fired at close range to mimic the effect of the traditional SRM-6. 4 ER medium lasers were all placed in their traditional locations of right arm and side torsos, and finally an anti-missile system was installed into the right torso along with its 1 ton of ammunition, also kept safe by that Case 2. The Guillotine 1MF would be a nasty brawler in the mid and short range, where the 2 MRM launchers could act as a shotgun while the plasma rifle and ER medium lasers opened up armor. The heat-generating benefit of the plasma rifle would hopefully act to limit the amount of return fire, prolonging the mech's battlefield utility. If you want to give it a shot, I've included the PDF record sheet for this totally unofficial and non-canon mech in the video notes below. I'm definitely going to have to give this a go next time I can get Mini Frog into a game. At the intersection, Rafe threw the guillotine into a hard left turn, sending the 70-ton mech skidding across the street. He growled as he fought the momentum, keeping the heavy mech on its feet. The screech of metal on the road surface was audible in the cockpit. The guillotine's foot struck a car parked in the street and crushed it. As he brought his mech under control again, a blood-red marauder appeared at the next intersection and opened fire, its PPCs and autocannon hammering Rafe's left side. Ignoring the loss of more than 1.5 tons of armor, Rafe fired back. Lasers and short-range missiles raced through the air and slammed into the Combine mech. No greater honor. No Tears, page 64, by Craig A. Reed Jr. So why do we love the Guillotine? Besides that dashing and adorable visage, maybe it's the noble lineage taking it all the way back through major conflicts for more than 600 years. Perhaps it's the solid loadout and good balance between power, agility, and defense. Personally, I think we just crave the revolutionary spirit. Vive la France! Vive la Revolution! Liberty, equality, fraternity. Perhaps not. The Guillotine has always been one of my favorite inner sphere heavy mechs, and I consider it one of the best mechs within that 2750 technical readout. Fans of the channel know I love a good generalist, and the Guillotine pushes all those buttons and turns all the cranks. But I'm curious what you think. Is the Guillotine part of your BattleTech menagerie, or is it not your date to the dance? Let me know in the comments and we'll keep that conversation going. If you enjoy the video and want to see more, there should be a few choice options on the screen momentarily so that the nonsense can continue. If you haven't already, hitting that like and subscribe button will make sure that YouTube algorithm is happy, and as a result, you'll be much more likely to see my content in the future. Going the extra step and becoming a channel member or supporting on Ko-fi will go a long way to making sure I can keep this project going. I really appreciate it and the opportunity to do my part to support BattleTech. With that, I'll say have an awesome week. Please stay positive, go out and make the world a slightly better place today and tomorrow.